Most economic crises don't start with chaos. They start quietly with small cracks that people ignore because nothing feels catastrophic yet. But if you pay attention to the pattern forming in America right now, the signs look eerily familiar. Businesses collapsing one by one, consumers pulling back, credit tightening, jobs disappearing, real estate weakening, confidence fading. It's the same kind of slow-motion pressure that built up before the Great Depression, not a sudden crash, but an accumulation of unresolved problems stacking over time. 2025 isn't defined by one dramatic event. It's defined by a shift in the entire system, a struggling corporate landscape, an exhausted middle class, fragile banks, and an economy pulled in multiple directions by inflation, high interest rates, AI disruption, and structural imbalance. This video isn't about predicting doom. It's about understanding the pattern, the way each small fracture connects to the next, forming the foundation of something much larger. Because before every major economic collapse in history, the early signs always look the same: slow, quiet, and easy to dismiss. Until suddenly, they're not. It's strange how history doesn't just repeat itself. Sometimes it rhymes. And when you look closely at what's happening in the US economy right now, the rhythm feels uncomfortably familiar. Because almost a century ago, the Great Depression didn't begin with empty streets, food lines, or banks collapsing overnight. It started with something much quieter: companies failing, one after another, until the entire system cracked. Back in 1929, thousands of businesses across America ran out of cash, defaulted on debt, or simply couldn't keep up with a market that was tightening faster than anyone expected. Profits evaporated, production slowed, investors panicked. And once investors panic, everything else follows. Now, fast forward to 2025, and the signs look eerily similar. All year long, we've watched a surge in corporate bankruptcies, not just from small local shops struggling to survive after years of inflation, but from mid-sized companies, major retailers, and even well-known brands that once felt too big to fail. The kind of companies that were supposed to be pillars of the American economy suddenly don't have enough cash to pay their loans, their leases, or even their workers. And it's not happening in just one sector. It's happening everywhere. Retail chains cutting locations, tech companies laying off thousands, transportation firms downsizing fleets, manufacturers quietly shutting down facilities because orders dried up. When industries collapse horizontally like this across multiple layers of the economy, it's almost always a signal that the foundation itself is cracking. Investors see this too. That's why throughout 2025, you've watched billions of dollars pulled out of riskier sectors. People aren't betting on growth anymore, they're just trying not to lose. This kind of fear-based movement is exactly what fueled the early stages of the Great Depression. Once investors lose confidence, the entire economy becomes a house of cards. And the layoffs. They're not slowing down. They're rolling through America like a leaking pipe that nobody bothered to fix drip by drip, week by week, until one day you realize the entire floor is flooded. These job cuts aren't strategic restructurings. They're survival tactics. Companies aren't preparing for growth. They're preparing for impact. And that's the part that makes 2025 feel so unsettling. Because when you line up the data, the behavior, and the consequences, the pattern we're seeing today is almost a reflection of 1929. A slow creeping unraveling that doesn't feel catastrophic at first, until it becomes impossible to ignore. This isn't about sensationalism. It's about recognizing that the early warning signs of the Great Depression weren't dramatic. They were subtle, quiet, easy to dismiss, just like the signs we're seeing now. If you really want to understand how an economy collapses, don't start with Wall Street. Don't start with banks or CEOs or interest rates. Start with something much simpler: the everyday American deciding not to spend. Because that's exactly how the Great Depression spiraled out of control. People stopped buying. Households held on to every dollar. Stores sold less, factories made less, and companies cut workers because there was nothing left to do. And when people lose their jobs, what's the first thing they cut? Spending. That feedback loop, that downward spiral, is what turned a normal recession into the worst economic disaster in US history. Now look at America in 2025, and tell me it doesn't feel familiar. For the last 2 years, inflation has eaten through people's savings, paychecks, and confidence. Groceries cost more, rent is insane, utilities keep climbing, and every month feels like it stretches farther than the one before. So regular Americans did what anyone would do: they changed their lifestyle. Not because they wanted to, but because they had to. Non-essential spending. It's dead. People aren't buying new clothes, gadgets, or weekend extras the way they used to. Eating out became a luxury. Vacations? Only if you're comfortable going into debt for a tan. And when consumer spending shifts on a national scale, the effects are brutal, especially in a country where 70% of the economy runs on consumption. Retailers are the first to feel the pain. That's why you see store closures happening everywhere, from malls to strip centers to chains that used to dominate the landscape. Some of these companies aren't just closing a few locations, they're disappearing. The truth is, the American consumer is exhausted. Inflation didn't just raise prices, it drained momentum. And the economy can't function when its core engine is running on fumes. But here's where the spiral really starts. When companies sell less, they cut costs. And the fastest way to cut costs is layoffs. Those layoffs destroy consumer spending even further, which forces more businesses to cut back, which triggers another round of job losses. It's the exact loop economists call an early-stage contraction cycle, a polite way of saying, this is how things fall apart. We're watching the same mechanics that triggered the Great Depression, not in dramatic, explosive headlines, but in the quiet decisions millions of Americans make every day when they choose survival over comfort. And that's the scary part. Not the crash itself, but the slow, silent pullback that comes before it. If inflation is the fire that burns through people's wallets, then high interest rates are the water the Fed throws on the flames. Except sometimes they throw so much water that they drown the entire house. That's the problem America is dealing with in 2025. Most people look at interest rates as this boring financial thing that only bankers care about. But when those rates stay high for too long, they become one of the most destructive forces in the entire economy. And we've seen this story before, almost 100 years ago. Before the Great Depression fully exploded, the Federal Reserve made a critical mistake. They kept rates too tight, too long. Businesses choked. Credit dried up. Companies collapsed, not because demand disappeared, but because they simply couldn't afford to borrow the money they needed to survive. Now look at 2025. For nearly 2 years, the Fed has kept interest rates sitting at levels the country hasn't seen in decades. And even though inflation has cooled down, those rates haven't. They stayed high month after month, like a pressure valve that never gets released. And the first casualties, companies with debt. When borrowing becomes expensive, cash flow becomes a battlefield. Loans get harder to renew, credit lines shrink, payments pile up, and suddenly, companies that looked stable on paper start gasping for air. That's exactly why thousands of U.S. companies, from man-pop shops to national brands, are now struggling to pay their loans, their leases, their equipment financing, even their basic operational costs. Not because they're bad businesses, but because the financial environment became hostile. Then you look at startups. For them, high interest rates are basically a death sentence. Startups survive on funding. Funding comes from investors. Investors borrow money too, and when interest is expensive, the money stops flowing. So in 2025, we're watching entire sectors of innovation freeze. Good ideas die on the table. Teams disband. Projects disappear. Not because technology failed, but because the cost of capital slammed the door shut. And this is where the domino effect starts. Small banks, especially regional and community lenders, are feeling the pressure. They're sitting on commercial real estate loans that are losing value. They're holding corporate loans that aren't being repaid on time. They're tightening their own lending just to stay afloat. This is the exact kind of financial stress the U.S. banking system experienced in the period before the Great Depression, not after it began. The pressure built slowly, quietly, invisibly, until one day it wasn't invisible anymore. High rates don't just slow the economy, they choke it. And when that chokehold lasts too long, companies start falling one by one. Not because Americans stopped believing in them, but because the lifeline they depended on slowly disappeared. One of the biggest misunderstandings about economic collapses is this idea that they start in one specific sector, like housing, or tech, or manufacturing, and then slowly spread outward. That's not how the worst crises happen. The Great Depression didn't explode because one industry failed. It exploded because every industry began breaking at the same time. Factories shut down. Farms went bankrupt. Public works ran out of funding. It wasn't a single fire. It was an entire landscape burning at once. And that's exactly what 2025 is starting to look like. Because when you track what's happening across the American economy right now, it's not just one sector flashing red. It's retail, it's tech, it's real estate, it's logistics, it's manufacturing, it's energy. It's the startup ecosystem that once powered American innovation. You can pick almost any industry, and you'll find the same story repeating itself. Lower revenue, higher costs, shrinking margins, mass layoffs, and some kind of strategic restructuring, which is just corporate language for trying not to collapse. Retail chains are disappearing because consumers can't afford to spend. Tech giants are cutting thousands because growth slowed to a crawl. Startups are dying because funding froze. Real estate firms are imploding because high rates crushed property values. Logistics companies are downsizing because the supply chain never fully recovered. Even energy companies, usually the most resilient, are reporting financial pressure. This isn't a sector problem, it's a system problem. And when a system breaks, it doesn't break in one place. It cracks everywhere at once. That's the part economists don't like to say out loud. Multi-industry downturns are rare, and when they show up, they usually signal the early stages of something much bigger. In the 1930s, it was the point where normal economic hardship turned into a full-scale national collapse. The pattern we're seeing today is almost identical. Different industries, different technologies, different time period. But the same underlying mechanics. Businesses losing stability, not in isolation, but together. A synchronized downturn. And synchronized downturns are dangerous because they feed into each other. Tech layoffs hurt consumer spending. Slower consumer spending hurts retail. Retail closures hurt logistics. Commercial real estate collapses hurt banks. Bank stress hurts lending. Less lending hurts startups. Every industry becomes both a victim and a trigger. That's how an economy slides from a recession into something deeper, something structural. The kind of collapse historians look back on and say, yeah, that was the turning point. If you want to know when an economy is truly in trouble, don't look at the stock market. Don't look at tech layoffs. Look at real estate. Because real estate has always been the pressure point of the American economy, the place where cracks show up long before anyone notices the entire system is unstable. And that's exactly what happened before the Great Depression. Back then, it wasn't just factories collapsing or banks failing. It started with two pillars of the economy quietly breaking down: land values and agriculture. Property prices fell, farms went bankrupt, and the financial institutions tied to that land started to buckle. By the time the public realized what was happening, the damage had already spread everywhere. Now jump to 2025, and the pattern is disturbingly familiar, just in a modern form. The collapse is happening in commercial real estate. Downtown office towers in major U.S. cities, once symbols of economic strength, are sitting half empty. Some are nearly deserted, because after remote work reshaped the entire culture of employment, companies never came back the way landlords hoped they would. And the vacancy rates aren't just high, they're historic. For a lot of buildings, the math stopped making sense. When a skyscraper loses 30% to 50% of its value, that's not a market correction. That's a structural failure. That's a sign the foundation of urban economics is shifting underneath everyone's feet. And here's the part people forget. Most of those buildings were financed with massive loans backed by banks. Banks that now have to deal with properties worth far less than the debt tied to them. Banks that depend on those buildings being profitable when they clearly aren't. This is why regional and mid-sized banks are starting to feel real pressure. Their balance sheets are full of commercial real estate exposure that suddenly looks toxic. And when banks get nervous, they tighten credit. They pull back on lending. They stop taking risks. And once lending freezes, the rest of the economy loses oxygen. Real estate is more than just buildings. It's collateral. It's leverage. It's the backbone of the financial system. So when commercial real estate breaks, the entire financial architecture around it starts to shake. This is why economists call real estate crashes an early indicator of depression-level stress. Because you're not just watching property lose value, you're watching the system. That depends on those values slowly destabilize. And right now, America is watching that process happen in real time. The empty offices, the falling valuations, the stressed banks, the tightening credit. It's not dramatic. It's not loud. But it's significant, and it's exactly the kind of quiet collapse that historically shows up right before everything else starts slipping. If you look back at the 1930s, the Great Depression wasn't defined by a single crash or a single policy error. It was defined by momentum, a chain reaction that started slow, then accelerated until the entire economy collapsed under its own weight. Unemployment eventually hit 25%, and once the spiral began, stopping it became almost impossible. And the uncomfortable truth is this: 2025 isn't at 1930s unemployment levels, but the pattern, the order of collapse, looks disturbingly familiar. It always starts with the same industry, the one that's over-leveraged, overconfident, and This time, it was tech. When tech companies began announcing layoffs, Meta, Google, Amazon, Tesla, the forever growth giant sent a signal the market wasn't ready to accept. Even the most profitable sector couldn't justify its payroll anymore. Then retail followed. Walmart cutting shifts, Target closing stores, small chains evaporating overnight because foot traffic keeps declining and consumer spending keeps tightening. After that came logistics, the very sector that exploded during the pandemic. Warehouses reducing headcount, delivery routes consolidated, trucking companies downsizing fleets because orders keep shrinking quarter after quarter. Hospitality didn't hold either. Hotels cutting staff because business travel still hasn't returned to pre-2020 levels. Restaurants quietly laying off cooks, servers, managers because the math no longer works when customers are ordering less and wages and rent keep climbing. And now, in 2025, you're seeing the early cracks in finance. Private equity firms freezing hiring, banks restructuring, insurance companies reporting losses large enough to justify strategic workforce reductions, a sanitized way to say you're fired. The problem isn't just layoffs. The real danger is the feedback loop they trigger. People lose jobs gives people stop spending, gives businesses lose revenue, gives businesses cut more jobs, gives repeat. It's a self-destructive economic loop, the same one that defined the 1930s. Not as dramatic yet, not as catastrophic on paper, but the underlying mechanism, the engine of the downturn, is the same. It feeds on itself. It accelerates with every lost paycheck. And like the 1930s, once this cycle gains momentum, it doesn't reverse just because the government says the economy is strong. Layoffs don't care about press conferences. They care about survival. This is how depressions actually form. Not in a single moment, but in waves, each one larger than the last, until the entire system is forced to reset. Every major economic crisis has a psychological breaking point. Long before charts crash, long before layoffs spike, long before historians give it a name, people's belief in the system cracks first. That's exactly what happened before the Great Depression. It wasn't the collapse of 1929 that destroyed the economy. It was the collapse of trust that followed. And today, 2025 feels eerily similar. Consumer sentiment surveys have fallen to their lowest level since 2008. That's not just a number on a report. It's a reflection of how millions of households perceive their future: uncertain, pressured, and shrinking. When people stop believing tomorrow will be better than today, they instinctively shift into survival mode. You can see it everywhere. Families cutting discretionary spending, parents delaying vacations, postponing medical procedures, scaling back on groceries, switching from want to need in every purchase. They're not trying to optimize, they're trying to endure. Investors feel it too. Not the high-risk gamblers on the internet, but real institutional money. The kind that builds factories, funds, infrastructure, creates jobs. They're pulling back. They're hesitant to invest in the real economy because the underlying of Nell's demand, stability, policy, clarity look unstable, uncertain, unsafe. And households? They've practically slammed the brakes on credit. Mortgage applications fall. Auto loans stall. Credit card balances flatten, not because people are paying them off, but because they're terrified of taking on new debt. For an economy built entirely on spending and borrowing, a sudden retreat like this is like cutting off oxygen. This is the part most people underestimate. When confidence collapses, the economy doesn't need a crash to slow down. It just stalls. Demand falls. Investment freezes, capital stops circulating, and the system sinks into a kind of quiet paralysis. That's what happened in the late 1920s. The public lost faith in the narrative of growth, and the economy followed their psychology straight into a depression. 2025 is showing the same pattern. Less dramatic, more modern, but unmistakably familiar. A society that no longer trusts its own economic future is already halfway into a downturn. All it needs is one more shock, one more trigger, for the slowdown to become something much deeper. Confidence isn't just sentiment, it's the foundation holding the entire machine together. And right now, that foundation is cracking. One of the biggest misconceptions about major economic collapses is the idea that they're purely financial. Markets crash, banks fail, companies go bankrupt, and that's the whole story. But historically, the worst downturns didn't happen just because money ran out. They happened because the structure of the economy shifted faster than society could adapt. That's what made the Great Depression so devastating. America wasn't just dealing with a stock market crash. It was grappling with a sudden transition into machine-driven industrialization. Factories reorganized, jobs disappeared, entire labor markets changed before workers even understood what was happening. Fast forward to 2025, and the same phenomenon is unfolding, but at a much higher speed. AI and automation aren't coming. They've already arrived, and they're rearranging the economy faster than businesses can adjust. Every industry, from logistics to finance, from manufacturing to customer service, is being rewritten in real time. Companies that relied on traditional workflows are suddenly uncompetitive. Businesses built on manual processes can't keep up with AI-driven competitors. Entire sectors are finding themselves outdated overnight. And the ones that can't pivot quickly enough, they fold, quietly, one by one. This isn't just a recession. It's a structural shock, the economic equivalent of the floor moving beneath your feet. And that's exactly what echoes 1929. Back then, technology reshaped labor. Today, technology is reshaping labor and productivity and operational models all at once. The speed of change is outrunning corporate adaptation. And when the system transforms faster than businesses, workers, and institutions can adjust, the economy enters a fragile state. That fragility is the real danger. A financial downturn can be reversed with stimulus and monetary policy, but a structural shift, that's a different kind of crisis, slow, deep, and irreversible. This is why the current economic stress feels larger than a typical recession. It's not just lost jobs and bankrupt companies. It's the underlying architecture of the economy being rebuilt on the fly, with millions of people caught in the transition. And like the early 1930s, the economy isn't just falling, it's transforming. Rapidly, unevenly, dangerously. When structural change outruns society's ability to adapt, a downturn becomes something more permanent, something that looks a lot like the early stages of a depression.